Hello farmers! If you're new to the channel, hi, I'm Remy, farming sim critic and enjoyer of naps. Like many in the fandom, Mineral Town has a very special place in my heart. Most cozy gaming enthusiasts will be familiar with the Game Boy Advance version of it, released on December 12, 2003 in Japan, and July 26, 2005 in the West. I, however, first became acquainted with it through the PSP remaster of the PS1 game, Back to Nature for Girls, which was originally released on December 7th, 2000 in Japan, but did not receive an English release until July 31st, 2007 when it was repackaged as Harvest Moon Boy and Girl on the PSP. If you've never heard of it before, I don't blame you. It's not exactly the most popular incarnation of Mineral Town, but it is my favorite version of it. When the Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town remake was originally announced, the fandom exploded with excitement, myself included. It was released on October 17, 2019 in Japan for the Switch, and July 14, 2020 in the US. That was a wild year. Everybody remember that? Just going off of its name, it can be assumed that this game is using the Game Boy Advance version of Mineral Town as its basis. But I still wanted to include Back to Nature in my analysis because the GBA version of Mineral Town was a remake of Back to Nature, though it took a lot of creative liberties. I have a bit of a fascination with remakes and adaptations, you see. It's really interesting to see what changes are made between different interpretations, and how a few tweaks here and there can completely change the impression that a work has on its audience. This video has been a long time coming. It's actually one of the main reasons that I created this channel to begin with. I wanted to not only talk about the things I liked and disliked about the Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town remake, I also wanted to talk about the things I enjoyed about the previous incarnations of Mineral Town, and why I do or don't like the changes that were made in the remake. Did it live up to the hype? For me, it's debatable. I'm going to do my best to try and explain why I don't really have a definitive answer to that question over the course of this video. Oh, and I only played the girl versions of each game because I simply did not have the time to go over the guy versions as well. So at some point in the future, I'll get around to making that video. Unlike the Story of Seasons remake, there are a lot of interesting differences in how the characters interact with the player based on which gender you play as in the older versions, along with some aesthetic changes, and even a completely different affection system for Back to Nature specifically that would be interesting to look at. But we're not doing that today. In most cases, I'm not a stickler for a remake needing to stick exactly to the source material. The differences are what make each adaptation charming. So my criticisms aren't based on how similar to the original the remakes are. All I care about is whether the changes made the game more fun to play or made the characters more interesting. I enjoyed the Story of Seasons remake a lot, and I do recommend it as an entry point into the series for most people. But I'd be lying if I said that I was completely satisfied with it as a remake. Not so much as a fan of the Mineral Town games specifically, but more so as a fan of the Story of Seasons series as a whole. I'll get into much more detail about why that is in the latter half of the video, but before that, I wanted to clarify a few things for the people that are new to the Story of Seasons series, or that haven't played a Harvest Moon game in years and have no idea why it's referred to as Story of Seasons now. The Japanese company that actually created these games is called Marvelous, and for the game's English releases, Marvelous partnered with Natsume Incorporated to have them translate their games into English for the Western market. In 2014, Marvelous established its own English localization company called Xseed, who at that point took over translating the Harvest Moon titles into English. However, Natsume kept the copyright for the Harvest Moon brand name, so Xseed could not release the games under the name Harvest Moon, and they had to rebrand the series as Story of Seasons. Meanwhile, Natsume decided to create their own farming sim games, and they began to release them under the Harvest Moon brand name. It was very scummy of them in my opinion, and no amount of curiosity has compelled me to actually play any of their original titles, so I can't attest to the quality of their games. But from what I've seen other people say about them, I don't think I'm missing out on too much. But hey, if you're curious, by all means, feel free to check them out. Just keep in mind that the modern Harvest Moon games have nothing to do with the pre-2014 Harvest Moon games that many of us grew up with. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this review. I always like to start off with the art style and character designs, since that's the first thing that we notice about these games before we even start playing. Igusa Matsuyama was in charge of character designs across every version of Mineral Town, so the differences between them have more to do with the general aesthetic that the games are going for, more so than any particular difference in art styles. The character designs for Back to Nature are actually pretty funny because they're literally just copy and pasted over from Harvest Moon 64, but the characters themselves have completely different backstories and personalities in Back to Nature. Shout out to Josh from Josh's Gaming Garden, who explains in his Back to Nature video how Back to Nature was originally supposed to be a remake of Harvest Moon 64 for the PlayStation, but shenanigans ensued and we ended up with the Back to Nature we know of instead. I really recommend that you go watch his video if you want more details on how that mix-up happened. It's really good. Anyway, that explains why they didn't change any of the character designs to actually match their new roles in Back to Nature. While they can look out of place at times, honestly, since I've never played Harvest Moon 64, it's not something that bothers me. At least not at the moment. I feel like they match the overall vibe of the game pretty well, even if they don't always make sense. I really like the soft edge that the character designs have in this game. Something about these designs is really comforting to me, and I think that that's the sort of feeling that the developers wanted to convey to the players with Back to Nature. The in-game graphics can be a little bit jarring and disconnected. Some areas look a lot more realistic than others, and the character sprites don't always fit into the environment around them. Despite all that, it still manages to feel rustic and charming in its own way. I can't really explain why exactly, maybe it's the color palette, but when I look back on these old game clips, it really just makes me want to play the game again. It just feels cozy to me. Now with Mineral Town GBA, the character designs are a little more playful. The outlines are darker and the lines are sharper. They have a distinctly different feel to them than the softer and more mature look of the Back to Nature designs. And that's reflected pretty well in the storytelling style of both games. Though it's a remake, they actually changed the character interactions between the player and the romanceable characters. And they even tweaked their personalities. It's not to the same extent as the shift from Harvest Moon 64 to Back to Nature, but if you play them back to back, you can definitely see how different the characters come off in comparison. I think it was an interesting choice to leave the character designs relatively the same as Back to Nature's. It was a good opportunity for them to update the character designs to better match their new environment and personalities. But perhaps they wanted to keep a sense of familiarity for the Back to Nature fans and decided to keep them recognizable. I'm not sure. The in-game graphics for Mineral Town GBA are in the iconic pixel style, and I would argue that this particular game in the series had a significant influence on the visual style of games like Stardew Valley and Fields of Mystria, to name a few. Admittedly, coming right off of Back to Nature, it doesn't feel nearly as detailed, and I was a bit thrown off by the completely different map layout of the town, but it quickly grew on me and had its own sense of charm the longer I played the game. I also wasn't a huge fan of the color scheme of the game. It's a little too bright for my personal preference, but that's a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things. I do think that it perfectly matches the tone that they were going for though. It's bright, playful, and inviting. It's like a sunny summer day versus Back to Nature's more contemplative, rainy day vibe. I do prefer the softer look of the characters in Back to Nature, but I don't dislike the new coat of paint that they gave the GBA designs. It matches the new direction that they wanted to take the characters in well, and they're still recognizable, so it's all good. Now let's talk about the Story of Seasons remake's designs. For this game, they actually did redesign and modernize the characters, and from what I understand, this choice was made in order to put some distance between them and the Back to Nature version of the characters, and to give the game its own identity, which is why they should have done it for the GBA remake instead of waiting until now to do it. It probably wouldn't have been as big of a deal if the characters were more different from their GBA counterparts. The GBA version of the characters are different enough from the Back to Nature renditions that it would have made a lot more sense to redesign them then. But the Story of Seasons versions of the characters are similar enough to the GBA versions that it doesn't really warrant a new identity. And to be honest, most people probably haven't even played Back to Nature, so it wasn't really a needed change. The fan base is understandably very split over the redesigns. I don't dislike the new character designs myself, though I'm not particularly fond of them either. Some of them I really like Ron's redesign. I think that the contrast of her tomboyish personality with the more feminine look actually makes her more charming. But then there's Gray, which I don't know, the red pants are kind of throwing me off honestly. He's from the city, so I get that they were going for more of a fashionable city boy aesthetic, and his dialogue is also current to the times, at least as of the recording of this video, but Gray never came off as someone who would care that much about fashion, so I'm not sure that I agree with this interpretation. And while I do think that Cliff's new haircut is kinda cute, I like the ponytail more personally. Changing the character designs that people have become familiar with after such a long time was going to cause backlash whether they were amazing or not. I don't know how new players feel about the character designs in the remake. I've been in the fandom for too long, so I'm biased towards what I grew up with. If you happen to be hip with what the youths are saying about the redesigns, then by all means, let me know in the comments. The in-game graphics for Story of Seasons didn't exactly help its case either. The GBA version's pixel graphics work really well because you're playing on a relatively small screen, and you can only fit so many details onto the characters. But with this remake, the characters just look really chonky and unserious in this art style, regardless of whether you play it on a big screen or not. A more detailed chibi style probably would have worked a lot better, like for instance Magical Melodies. I did poke a little bit of fun at it in my previous review, but as far as chibi styles are concerned, it actually looked pretty good. I mean, you can argue that Back to Nature's character sprites were also chibi, but personally I felt that the model proportions made them look more adultish compared to the remakes at least, so for me it doesn't really fall into the same category. The general look of the game also gives off a plasticky and cheap feeling. It's giving mobile game assets. I believe that this particular remake wasn't made by the main Story of Seasons team, but considering how beloved Mineral Town is amongst the fans of the series, you'd think that they would put a little more effort into the game's presentation. All that aside, if you can get past how the game looks, it plays really well. I actually found myself having a lot more fun than I remembered having the first time I played it when it was first released. And even though they're dated, both Back to Nature and the GBA remake are enjoyable in their own right. The first major difference that we encounter between the three games is actually the fact that you can choose your gender in the Story of Seasons remake, and you have two designs to choose from for each gender. Both Back to Nature for girls and More Friends of Mineral Town are the female version of their respective games, and you can only play as a female character in them. This game is the first Mineral Town game where you can play either or on the same cartridge. Now unfortunately, you don't have the option to be non-binary in this particular Story of Seasons game, and you don't have access to the other gender's wardrobe. There's also only 3 options for the skin color type, which is a shame because 2 of the 3 are almost the same, and the only darker skin tone is light brown. It's better than being given no option whatsoever like in the previous incarnations, but I don't know. I just feel like for the time period that this game was released in, we could have done a little bit better here. Moving on to the character designs for the protagonist. I don't really care for the new characters, to be honest. Their designs are just kind of bland to me. I've always really liked Claire's design, so I stuck with her this time around as well. Next, we have our intro into each game. Though it may seem like a minor detail, the intro actually does a lot to set the tone of each respective game, and that will become more apparent when we get to the character section of the review. But for now, let's just talk about how each game went about introducing us to their world. Let's begin with Back to Nature's. The intro is very cinematic. Your character is on a ship to who knows where, when she meets an older gentleman and they immediately become besties. They hang out for a lot of the trip, and the man gives our character a lot of life advice, telling her that she doesn't owe anybody anything and that she should live freely. Suddenly, the ship gets caught up in a storm and presumably gets destroyed in the process. When our character wakes up, she finds herself in Mineral Town, where the mayor allows her to take over the rundown old farm since she has no family and nowhere to go. This is such an interesting intro to me. The execution is a little bit clumsy, but it does a good job highlighting the somewhat somber undertones of the game from the very beginning. I have so many questions about our protagonist. What happened to her family? Where was she planning to go before the shipwreck? And what happened to all of the other passengers on the ship? We never get answers to these questions, but based on the bits and pieces of dialogue we sometimes get when we check the mirror in the game, we can assume that our protagonist didn't have a very happy life before moving to Mineral Town. And that feeling of melancholy that the protagonist seems to carry seeps into the feel of the rest of the game. Again, I'll talk more about this aspect later, but it is something to think about as we move on to the other games and their intros. Next, we have the intro for More Friends of Mineral Town on the Game Boy Advance. We start off the game as an exhausted corporate employee looking for something exciting to do with our lives. And while reading the newspaper one night, we stumble upon an ad for a farm that our character, desperate to leave the 9-to-5 grind, I feel you sister, immediately calls up to purchase. When we get to the farm, we find out that it's a complete dump, and the mayor laughs in our face for being gullible enough to fall for the ad. Being the girl boss that she is, our character does not take kindly to his teasing and hits him with a hammer. Personally, I don't think that I would have gone that far, maybe slap his face a few times if anything, but our girl was not playing with this man. After apologizing, the mayor tells our character to just keep the farm and try to make it work, since she already quit her job and moved out of her apartment. Our character's like, yeah, okay, why not? And so begins our adventure. This intro is much more comedic than the original. Unlike Back to Nature that was a lot more grounded, Mineral Town GBA leans a lot more into absurdity. This game introduces a lot more magical elements than Back to Nature did, which, aside from the Harvest Goddess and the Harvest Sprites, didn't stray too far from the mundane. For me, besides the fact that the games share the same cast of characters and backstories for the non-romanceable characters, this version of Mineral Town might as well be a completely different game. Which is why I find it odd that they chose not to change the character designs at this point to distinguish it a bit from its predecessor, because between the town layout changing, the introduction of the cursed tools, the ability to marry the Kappa and Gourmet, along with the fact that all of the hard events were changed, this game is almost nothing like Back to Nature. Personally, I don't like this intro nearly as much, but it gets the job done as far as intros are concerned. And like I said earlier, it does a good job of setting our expectations for the rest of the game. Finally, we have the intro for the Story of Seasons remake. Our character receives a letter in the mail from the mayor of Mineral Town telling us that our grandfather left us farmland, and we immediately take off to Mineral Town to take it over. We got a cute little flashback montage of our character spending the summer at the farm as a child, and it succinctly explains why we left our old life behind to come take over the farm. It's simple, but I really like this intro. It's not as dramatic as the Back to Nature intro, and it isn't an arbitrary choice that our protagonist made one day out of boredom, like in Friends of Mineral Town. I don't know if it's my favorite out of the three, but I like it a lot. There isn't that much of a difference in the gameplay of each version per se. All of the crucial elements are pretty much the same, but there is quite a difference in the quality of life improvements from game to game, so let's go over them in this next section. Starting off with Back to Nature again, the gameplay for this game actually feels surprisingly smooth most of the time. The tool animations are pretty quick and snappy, especially compared to Magical Melody, for example. Switching tools was relatively simple, and moving through the different menus was easy enough once you got a hang of the controls. I really like this menu here that shows you your tool's progress towards getting upgraded. For some reason they removed this menu from the Story of Seasons version of the game. And it really irritated me that if I wanted to check how far along my tools were, I had to go to Saibara's shop to check. If there's a button that opens it up that I just never found, let me know, because it's honestly one of my least favorite aspects of the game. One thing I really liked about the bag in Back to Nature is how your tools and items were in separate pockets. You do start off with very limited inventory space, and even the biggest bag upgrade doesn't give you that much more space. But for the most part, it wasn't as big of an issue as it was in some of the older games in the series, helped all the more by how convenient it was to switch between tools. Actually, it's kind of crazy to me that they didn't keep the tools and items separated in later games. Why? I'm filing this one away as another useful feature that never got brought back for some reason. Another thing that really set this entry apart for me was the inclusion of the basket. It can hold 30 items, and you can take it pretty much everywhere with you. The only downside is that you can't take anything out of it once you've dropped it in there, and it's really easy to empty the basket by accident by pressing the wrong button, so you do have to be a little bit careful when you're carrying it. You lose friendship points for littering, aka dropping items in this entry, so just be really careful. It can get pretty tedious, not gonna lie. There are a lot of items that you can't ship, so if you want to get rid of them, you have to mosey on over to the town square to toss it out. It's really annoying when you accidentally pick up a weed, for instance, but with these older games you just have to roll with the punches. The limited inventory space would have been a lot more frustrating without the basket, but having it in the game made it a lot more playable. It functions pretty much the same way in the GBA version, with the only difference being that in the GBA version, you can't accidentally spill its contents anymore. So I'll give the GBA version a point for that. The Story of Seasons version of the game doesn't include the basket as an item, but you have a lot more inventory space and all items stacked, so you don't really need to have the basket anymore. Honestly though, I was so used to using one that I did feel a little bit sad when I didn't see it at the shop. Farming in Back to Nature is not as bad as you'd think it would be. In fact, I found it easier than in the GBA version, but we'll circle back to that later. For one, it's relatively easy to upgrade your tools. By the end of spring, I could upgrade my watering can all the way up to mithril if I wanted to, and you can actually find high-level ores on the lower floors of the mines, so you really didn't have to go that deep to be able to get what you needed for your tools. I think I ended up settling for the gold watering can for the entirety of Back to Nature. However, if you're playing the GBA version or the Story of Seasons version, and you're planning to get the cursed tools, then you have to upgrade your tools to mithril to unlock them. Like Magical Melody, you can't walk through your crops here, so it doesn't really make sense to plant your crops in anything but 3x3 squares most of the time. Unless you're going to have the harvest sprites do all of your farming for you, which is a valid way to approach the game if you want to spend most of your time befriending the townspeople instead of farming. I would actually encourage that for the girl version of Back to Nature, since the game ends once you get married. Stamina in this game wasn't a huge issue. Actually, I felt like I ran out of stamina a lot faster in the Story of Seasons remake than in either Back to Nature or Mineral Town GBA. One thing to note in the Back to Nature and GBA versions is that there's no bar to see how much stamina you have left. Instead, your character will perform increasingly dramatic actions to alert you of their exhaustion, which the remake retained and I actually dislike. And when they're about to pass out, their face will turn blue. As for why I didn't like it in the remake, it just felt redundant since we have the bar on screen now. And it's really annoying getting constantly interrupted from whatever task you're doing. When you run out of stamina, you can take a dip in the hot spring near your farm. In the Mineral Town games, there's no limit to how many times you can use it throughout the day. You can cook too, but cooking is a bit more challenging in Back to Nature and the GBA versions, since you have to manually write down the recipes before you can make them. I don't remember if the recipe gets saved once you've cooked it in Back to Nature like it does in the GBA version, but honestly, I didn't cook much if at all during my playthrough. You can't ship cooked foods in any of the Mineral Town games, so they're really only useful for hoarding to go to the mines or to gift people. And because of how limited the inventory is in the older games, it was just impractical to carry dishes around most of the time for me. You can also get the harvest sprites, or nature sprites as they're called in the Story of Seasons remake, to help you water and harvest your crops. You just have to befriend them up to 3 hearts first. It's not that difficult to do. You can use either the colored grasses or buy them flour. They also like honey, which is easily accessible in the Story of Seasons remake. They're not going to be very good at first, but the more they do the same task over and over, the better they'll get. In the GBA version and its remake, there are mini games that you can play with them to help them improve at their tasks faster. The sprites are super helpful, but there are a few caveats if you're going to heavily rely on them. You have to make sure that you're constantly giving them gifts because they lose friendship points from helping out on the farm. In Back to Nature specifically, they will not help you do any chores in the spring. It does not matter how high your friendship is, they spend the entire season doing tea parties. So don't be like me and plant a million crops in year 2, thinking that they're gonna help you out, because they're not. They also only help out for a week at a time max. You can get them to help out for shorter lengths of time, but a week is about as much as they'll do. You have to be a little bit strategic about how you rotate them around if you're gonna fill up your field with crops. It can get really overwhelming when all of the sprites stop on the exact same day and you don't have enough stamina to water everything. That's why it's pretty crucial to upgrade your watering can as high as you can, as quickly as you can. For those days that they're not available to help you, and simply because the sprites might miss some squares when watering your crops from time to time. More so than watering my crops though, I found that the most useful things for the sprites to help me with in Back to Nature and Mineral Town GBA was to help me harvest the crops and help me collect animal products. Back to Nature's controls are pretty good for the most part, but when you're trying to pick up your chicken's eggs, it can be an utter nightmare. Sometimes the game just does not register the item in front of you no matter how much you click, and sometimes you'll pick up the item and accidentally drop it if you start clicking angrily like I often found myself doing. Side note, speaking of infuriating mechanics, there's this one mini game that you're forced to do in the fall in Back to Nature where you have to physically help pick the grapes over at the vineyard, and it is miserable. Picking the grapes doesn't actually remove them from the trees, so you're basically just clicking around randomly gathering these invisible grapes until Duke finally lets you leave. By the by, there's 16 of them, and you have to do it for a solid 5 or 6 days. It drove me bananas. If it wasn't because of my devotion to help Cliff, I absolutely would not have gone back to do it again. The minigame was removed from the other 2 versions of Mineral Town, which does not surprise me in the least. Back to what I was saying though, because of how bad the controls could be when it came to picking up animal products, it was simply easier to just have the sprites pick them up for me instead. Also, not gonna lie, with the limited inventory space, it got annoying really fast having to run back and forth to get feed for the animals. I know I could have just left them outside, but I didn't want them to get attacked by wild animals. And yes, that was a thing in the older games, and the main reason why you start the game out with a doggo. Speaking of our pup, you get a dog at the start of both Back to Nature and GBA Mineral Town, but in Story of Seasons you have a wider selection of pets to choose from. However, you can only purchase one after you've unlocked Van, who will then set up shop on the 2nd floor of the inn most days. He usually only sells ores and soundtracks, but he'll set up a pet stall on the 15th of every season. To unlock Van, you need to gift the Harvest Goddess every day for 30 days consecutively, so the sooner you do that the better. Back to the plot. In the older games, harvesting crops could be a tedious affair. Even with the basket, it could still take a significant portion of the day to get them all, and in both Back to Nature and Mineral Town GBA, you couldn't get the middle crop unless you cut one down. The harvest sprites, however, can harvest everything, including the crops that you can't reach. I also found it much more frustrating in Mineral Town GBA to tend to my crops, because of this very specific mechanic that they decided to include in it. When you get close to a crop or weed and there's an empty space near it, your character will automatically bunny hop over it. It was really cute at first, but it got old real quick when I was trying to cut down weeds, water the crops, or harvest them. I'm not ashamed to say that I relied heavily on the sprites in the GBA version, because it was honestly a miserable experience tending to my farm otherwise.
Stop it. No. Stop it. No. Stop it.
I am gonna make lose it. I'm gonna make lose it. You don't understand. You really don't understand. I was fighting with this girl. Rem, stop jumping. In the Story of Seasons remake, I still had the sprites help out on the farm, but it didn't feel nearly as urgent as in the other 2 entries. You can harvest your crops relatively quickly, and the field, in my opinion, isn't nearly as large as it is in the other two entries, so it doesn't take that long to get everything done. I prefer to take care of my animals myself so that I can use the makers and whatnot, so I really only had the sprites helping me to water my crops in Story of Seasons, whereas in the other two games I used them pretty evenly for all tasks. That's about it for the sprites, so let's briefly touch upon the animals, even though there's not much to say about them. In both Back to Nature and GBA Mineral Town, you can only get 3 different types of animals: chickens, sheep, and cows. In Story of Seasons, you can also get an alpaca and brown chickens. The brown chickens do not lay different colored eggs, so they're really just there to be cute, which is fine. However, there are different colored cows that produce different types of milk, so that does add a little bit of variety. A notable difference in the Story of Seasons version is that when you buy your animals, they have a 5 heart level cap, meaning that you can only befriend them up to 5 hearts. Obviously, that's not going to be enough to win any of the festivals in the game, so you're gonna have to breed them if you want to have animals with higher caps on their heart levels. I get super attached to my animals, so I don't really like this mechanic too much, but it did keep me busy for a while trying to get all my animals to 10 hearts. I do wish that they added more makers or things that you could do with the animal wool. The pool of animals that you can work with is really small in the Story of Seasons remake for some reason. There were a ton of animals that you could have in the 3DS games with unique types of wool and uses for them. I find that the Story of Seasons remake made a lot of changes to modernize the game, but they never took the changes far enough to really make them stand out. Like, even the mechanic to change your clothes is blandly done. It's great that we have more clothing options than either Back to Nature or the GBA version that only gives you 6 options, but all we get in this game is 2 different outfits in like 5 different colors each. I'm not counting the gag outfits because I never used them, but clearly they had the ability to include different types of clothing, so why didn't they? I would understand if it was still 2007 and the technology wasn't all the way there for character customization, but look at all the outfits you can get in Animal Parade, a game that was released in 2008. It's a minor complaint, I guess, but character customization is one of the features that I expect a modern Story of Seasons game to deliver on. I don't mind that we can't change the default physical traits of our character. I've always really liked Claire, so I'm fine with not being able to change her too much, but come on, they could have done a lot more here. Getting back to the animals, at the start of spring, you'll be gifted a horse that you need to take care of or it will be taken away from you in spring of year 2. Honestly, the horse is kinda useless in most versions of Mineral Town. You can use it for the horse race in the spring and fall once it's an adult, but for the first year, it's really just gonna be roaming around the farm for the most part. It's not enough to just talk to it every day either. If you don't brush it, its friendship points aren't going to go up fast enough for you to be able to keep it as an adult. You also can't take it outside of the farm in Back to Nature or the GBA version. You can only ride it around on your farm, which I guess can be useful, but I didn't really make much use of. In the Story of Seasons version, you can finally ride your horse all around the town, so that was a good change. Taking your animals in and out of the barn and coop in the older games was honestly a chore, so I never did it, but their friendship does go up faster if you do. You have the bells in the remake that you can ring instead of having to push them out one by one. Before I forget, let's talk about the crops in this game for a second. The farming is relatively simple compared to some of the other games in the series, so there isn't much you need to know about the crops that you can't guess pretty easily. But there are books in the library in all versions of the game that you can check out if you have any specific questions about them. For the most part, all versions of Mineral Town feature the exact same crops, with the exception of a few new ones that got added in for the fall in the Story of Seasons remake. Now here's my complaint, and maybe I'm alone on this one, but honestly, it bothers me that there isn't a wider selection of crops in the Story of Seasons version. I just feel like it was a huge missed opportunity. I remember being kind of bored during my playthrough. Keep in mind that I had already played through Back to Nature and the GBA version version back to back at this point, so I was feeling a bit burnt out on Mineral Town anyway, but then I instantly became more excited when I saw new seeds in the shop. It's just a bit baffling to me that they would only include new seeds in one season. I don't have too much of a problem with the farming being more simple in these entries. It's a good starting point for newbies and people who don't like the complexity in some of the other games, but variety would have just freshened things up a little bit is all I'm saying. I do like the inclusion of field levels, though I do think that having to wait a minimum of 4 years to be able to get the highest quality crops is a bit excessive, but I do understand why they wouldn't want to give us access to everything from the jump. Another interesting change that was made is that there's a difficulty setting in the Story of Seasons remake, which I'd honestly love to see them utilize in more titles in the future. I played normal mode, so I don't know exactly how much easier the game is if you choose the other option. Maybe I'll check it out at some point, but I'd love it if there were different ways to make the game more challenging in future titles without alienating the fans who want a more casual experience. Also, talking about baffling decisions. I don't even know if this is the right section to put it in. I'm gonna say it anyways. I don't know, you can try and fit it somewhere. Speaking of baffling decisions, they removed the hothouse from the GBA version and the Story of Seasons version, and I don't really understand why. If you're confused about the hothouse, I think that in other titles they named it the greenhouse. So like, genuinely, I don't know why they made that decision, but you know, whatever, I guess. Fine, let's just take things out of the game when it was already bare bones, I guess. Fine, do it. I think that about does it for the farm specific things I wanted to talk about. If there's anything I missed, then feel free to drop it in the comments. Taking a detour to the mines real quick, this is probably the most boring task that you'll do in the entire game. There are plenty of things to do in the mines, they're just not very fun. There are 2 mines in the game. One you always have access to, located near the hot spring, and the lake mine that's only available in the winter once the lake freezes over. The spring mine is where you'll find the materials you need to upgrade your tools, and if you're pursuing Gray, this is where you'll get his gifts from. In the Story of Seasons remake, once you obtain the tools, mythic ore will start appearing in the spring mine, and if you're collecting the goddess jewels, you'll also find them here. On the flip side, inside the lake mine, you'll find precious gemstones, and in both Mineral Town GBA and the Story of Seasons remake, you'll find the cursed tools and the kappa jewels. I love collecting things, so this is typically up my alley, but you have to invest an incredible amount of time to collect these items. To start with, you cannot use any of your tool upgrades inside of the mines. In Back to Nature and GBA Mineral Town, there aren't any pits that you can fall through, so you have to dig around to find the stairs on every floor. If the floors were small, it might not feel like such a chore, but some of the floors are huge, and there are 250 plus floors in each mine. You can imagine the excruciating amount of time that you'd need to spend in the mines to find the items that you're seeking. Now, thankfully in the Story of Seasons remake, there is a mine elevator, but you need to give the goddess 100 gifts first to unlock it, and it only stops on every 50th floor, so you're still going to have to struggle a bit here. Honestly, I didn't get that far in any of my playthroughs due to time constraints, but even if that wasn't the case, I don't know that I'd be that committed to pursuing any of those items of my own free will. If you want to marry the goddess or the kappa though, good luck, Charlie. For me, it's not really worth it to spend too much time in the mines. None of the items really sell for much, and aside from the ores you need for upgrading your tools and commissioning makers, you won't find yourself going there too often. And to be honest, you can buy a lot of those ores from Van once you unlock him anyway, so you really don't even really need to go in there if you don't want to at all. It's especially lackluster in Back to Nature because there aren't any jewels or cursed tools to collect in that game. But for the completionists out there who want a challenge, you've certainly got one. And more than likely you can find a power berry at the bottom like in most other games in the series, but I think I'm good. Before we jump into the festivals, there's one more thing I wanted to mention. In my playthroughs, I actually managed to miss the fishing rod in both Back to Nature and Mineral Town GBA. It wasn't really an issue in Back to Nature because you don't need it for anything important, but if you're collecting the cursed tools in either of the other 2 versions, you do need to have it upgraded all the way in order to find the the cursed tool in the mine. In Back to Nature, Juan hung out at the inn, so I really had no reason to go to Zach's shack. And in Mineral Town GBA, I never had an empty tool slot to activate the event for it. So this is just a heads up, just in case you're like me and you don't really explore every nook and cranny. As far as the festivals are concerned, for the most part, they remain the same across all versions, with the exception of 4 festivals that exist only in the Back to Nature version of the game. The first of the removed festivals is the Goddess Festival, which is held in the spring. The girls dress up in these really cute dresses and perform a dance to honor the goddess. In the first year, you're not going to be able to take anybody with you as a date, but in year 2 and beyond, you do have the opportunity to go with someone and get some really interesting responses from your rival if you do. I know it's a bit messy of me to enjoy that aspect of the Goddess Festival, but it was honestly kind of refreshing to see them react like an actual person would in that situation. Mess aside, it's a shame that they removed the festival in future versions of Mineral Town, since it was one of the few sort of romantic festivals, and I thought that the dresses were really cute, and it's a shame that this is the only entry where we get to wear it in the entire series. Also, I really like the little crumb of lore that we get from Gods, since he's the one who gives us his deceased wife's old dress to wear for the Goddess Festival. I thought that it was a really sweet moment, and showed a bit of vulnerability from the usually stoic Carpenter. His personality is completely different in the Story of Seasons remake. It's honestly kind of jarring, but you know, roll with the punches, as they say. The second festival that was removed was the Beach Festival. In this festival, there's a swimming minigame that you can participate in. I wasn't very good at it. I like to pretend that my character still has PTSD from the shipwreck and can't swim because of it. And not that I'm just terrible at minigames. The Beach Festival was replaced with the Fetch Fest in the Story of Seasons remake, which is a frisbee throwing competition for your pet. Funny story. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but at this point, you're probably already used to it. Okay, so actually, I don't have a pet yet in my current Story of Seasons playthrough. I haven't played this game in years, and I was trying to play the games without using a guide for the most part, so I completely forgot how to unlock Fan, and I didn't remember that I needed to do that until spring of year 2. In order to attempt to finish this video before the Grand Bazaar release, I limited myself to only playing through to the end of spring of year 2 in each entry, summer at the latest if it took a little longer to get married. Unfortunately, I can't say much about the pets since I haven't even seen the shop yet, but I'm sure that they're adorable. The third removed festival is the Tomato Festival, which is just another fun interactive festival where you split up into teams and throw tomatoes at your opponents. I was actually good at this one. It's not a big deal that it was removed, but it was fun, so it's a shame that they took it out. And finally, the last festival to be removed was the Dog Race, which was pretty similar to the horse race, but just with your dog instead. I don't feel one way or the other about this particular festival, but it wouldn't have hurt to keep it since there isn't much to do during the winter anyway. There's not much to say about the other festivals. They're pretty much what you'd expect from a farming sim, and none of them really stand out for the most part. Wait a minute. I just remembered actually, there is one more festival that was taken out that only exists in Back to Nature. It's the New Year's Festival. So with the New Year's Festival, Karen comes over to teach you the dance, and then when you get to the festival, you dance with one of the bachelors. I don't know why they removed it. Again, just more baffling decisions. They didn't want you to have any date festivals. Okay, back to what I was saying. What was I talking about? I'll just start over. There's not much to say about the other festivals. They're pretty much what you'd expect from a farming sim, and none of them really stand out for the most part, aside from the ones that were removed. One thing I do want to say though is that I really wish that more townspeople participated in the festivals. I don't know if it was just a thing in the 3DS era, or maybe the Mandela effect. but I could have sworn that all of the townspeople participated in every festival, yet I keep being surprised every time I play one of these older entries and find that only a handful of people show up to participate. It's just weird because every house and shop is closed on festival days, but then when you show up at the festival, there's only like 5 people there, which is why I really like the way that Tree of Tranquility went about doing it, because you could still visit people at their homes if they didn't attend the festival, and most of the time they'd have unique dialogue commenting about it. Alright folks, if you made it this far, congratulations! We're finally halfway through this video! Woohoo! I'm just joking, of course, but we do still have one more section to get through. This next section is actually what I most wanted to talk about in this video, but I'm not going to include all of my thoughts regarding the characterizations here, simply because there's just too much that I want to cover, and this video is already pretty long. I'll likely make a separate video or videos that cover all of the differences between the heart events of each character in each version of Mineral Town, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, then keep an eye out because that's coming at some point in the near future. To me, the cast of characters is the main reason that Mineral Town in particular stands out amongst the myriad of games in the series. Other Story of Seasons games have more complex farming systems or an overarching story to make them memorable. Mineral Town, on the other hand, has a well-rounded cast of characters. There are a ton of events and dialogue that show how the different characters play off of each other, making it feel more like an actual community and not just a ton of people who happen to live in the same town. For the most part, all of the events relating to the townspeople stay the same in every version, and it's the heart events for the romanceable characters that change completely from game to game. Before we talk about the quality of the heart events in each game, I do have to give credit where credit is due. Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town gives you the ability to romance any of the available love interests, regardless of gender, which is something that neither Back to Nature or the GBA versions of Mineral Town allow you to do. The only drawback I can think of is that certain unique dialogue gets lost since everyone views you as a potential love interest. The different interactions you have with the characters in the older games, depending on which gender you play as, are definitely something that intrigues me personally. But I think that you could get the same type of effect just from making friendship roots different from romantic roots. Or just have everything up to 10 hearts be platonic and have additional hearts unlocked only when you get into a relationship with the characters. They played a bit with this idea by having the musical notes represent friendship points with the characters and having a separate meter for the heart levels, but I just don't think that it was that well implemented into the game. It would have been better if the heart meter filled up after you completely max out the friendship meter. At this point in the series, I just feel that the 10 heart system is much too restrictive and should be done away with. It's fine for platonic relationships, but it should expand once you get into a romantic relationship with a character. Clearly it's possible, since they included it in Animal Parade post-marriage, so I'm not asking for anything that hasn't already been done in the series before. At the very least, there should be some kind of character arc post-marriage that shows that our spouse is still growing as a person. Your spouse shouldn't just be decoration for the house. Romance doesn't die the second you walk down the aisle, or at the very least it shouldn't. The relationships in Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town are very surface level, and if the 3DS games didn't exist, maybe I'd be able to give it a pass. I can't complain too much about the relationships in Back to Nature or More Friends of Mineral Town because those games came out 20 plus years ago. I will not be as forgiving for a game released in 2019 though. The removal of the rival heart events and rival marriages in the Story of Seasons remake is absurd to me. While rival events and marriages haven't been included in the series for a while, straight up erasing them from games that did include them originally is nasty work. And do not get me started on how bland the children in the game are. I really wanted your child to, at the very least, look different depending on which spouse you married. This game was released in 2019, y'all. 2019. I'm not asking for features that didn't already exist in previous games in the series. Again, Animal Parade knocked it out of the park in 2008. I mentioned earlier in the video that my first experience with Mineral Town was Back to Nature for girls. For as much as I adore it, Back to Nature is nowhere near the best game in the series. The dialogue is really repetitive, the mechanics are at best tolerable by today's standards, the visuals aren't great, and the game ends after you get married, regardless of which character you marry. This is only true of the girl version, by the way. Yeah, lots to unpack with that decision. Objectively speaking, it doesn't have a whole lot going for it besides vibes. However, it is the only one out of the three that was willing to put the player outside of their comfort zone when it comes to character interactions. Some of them are questionable by today's standards, for sure, but it's the only one that didn't avoid showing us the ugly side of these characters. It's the one that made me want to know more about the people living there. And it's such a shame that this version of Mineral Town is forever lost to time, because at least in the West, a lot of people simply never played this version. After I finished playing the Story of Seasons remake for the first time, I was disappointed, but I couldn't really put my finger on why that was. It's a perfectly fine game. I had fun playing it. I'm even looking forward to picking it back up for fun when I'm not working on projects for the channel. Most of the character events I remembered from my Back to Nature days were still intact, but the remake didn't really enhance the experience of playing Mineral Town for me. The characters had more dialogue than previous versions of the game, but somehow I don't feel like I got to know them any better than I did before. I'll be the first to admit that I didn't love the changes that the GBA version made to the characters. Some of them, like Gray, I really don't like. I find that the GBA version of Gray spends a lot more time complaining about his grandpa compared to his Back to Nature self, who felt a little bit more mature, although he was still a bit of a goof. Also, shout out to the translation team for the Story of Seasons remake. They made Gray's dialogue hilarious. Even though I don't care for some of the changes that the GBA version made, I can still appreciate the fact that they were willing to make those changes to begin with. The biggest change that the Story of Seasons remake did was add in post-dating events, which are definitely appreciated, but they're kind of bland. I'm not saying make everything doom and gloom, but you can definitely strive for a balance. For instance, I'm not the biggest fan of Stardew Valley, story for another day, but one of the things I do respect about it is how the characters have very strong, distinct personalities, and how their events cover a wide range of struggles that the average person might also be going through. There's plenty of humor interspersed between the more dramatic moments, so it doesn't get overwhelmingly dark at any point. At least from what I remember, do not quote me on that one. Some might argue that its continued popularity is mostly due to the gameplay, but I don't think that Stardew's gameplay is that unique to what the farming sim genre was already doing. I don't think that the character writing in Stardew is amazing or anything, but based on the sheer amount of fanfics in the Stardew tag on AO3, I imagine that it's at least part of the reason why the game continues to thrive in the community to this day. With Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town, I can't really say that the characters stand out to me as much in comparison to a Stardew or some of the newer farming sims in the market by today's standards. Bringing it back to what I said earlier in the video about the tone of each game, Back to Nature stands out to me because it's not afraid to include some moments in the characters' lives that made them feel like real people. Whereas the remakes might include some of those moments in the game, but they don't do much with it. Ultimately, I feel like the Story of Seasons remake plays it too safe. The GBA version wasn't trying to make the game any deeper than it was in Back to Nature, and it's evident by the way that it handled the hard events. I can't really blame it for that, since it was going for a completely different vibe than Back to Nature. I mean, look at which characters they added as love interests. Mineral Town GBA was never serious about anything, man. And let me be very clear, that's not a bad thing. Just because it's not my personal favorite interpretation of Mineral Town doesn't mean that it's a bad interpretation. I just wish that the Story of Seasons remake knew what it wanted to be. For the first 2 seasons, it feels like an upgraded version of the GBA version of Mineral Town. Then in the fall, it suddenly decides to include new mechanics like dating, and you're thinking, oh okay, I guess we're gonna see different and more fleshed out versions of these characters in this game. And then you finish their hard events and realize that no, that's really all there is to them. To illustrate my point, let's take Ron as our first example. Her hard events are all over the place. The first few heart events had a bit of a vision to them, but her post-dating events left a lot to be desired. They didn't know what to do with her at all, and by the end of her final event, I felt like I wasted my time in pursuing her. I wish that they leaned more into her feelings about not feeling girly enough, or maybe into her feelings about her mom, since those are things that were mentioned in some of her dialogue, but nothing was ever done with either of those ideas. And then there's Cliff, who arguably has the most fleshed out character arc across all 3 games. His final heart event is about him finally opening up to the rest of the townspeople after being withdrawn for most of the game, which is great, but the event that explains why he's so withdrawn to begin with is completely missable, and I actually did miss it in both the GBA and Switch remakes. I don't even know if it was a mandatory event in Back to Nature, since the guides we do have aren't super detailed, but it's wild to me that it's an optional and separate event from his heart events, when so much of his arc is based upon it. Like, you can literally just marry Cliff without ever knowing his backstory, and it never gets brought up after marriage. Why? This is something that I'll address in more detail in the heart event video, but seriously, I don't think it's asking too much for the game to try and make the characters more 3-dimensional. Granted, despite my best efforts, I didn't pursue everyone in the game, so I might have a different opinion of other characters' arcs when I go over them in detail, but I'm not holding my breath. The failure of the writing team to make the characters compelling is probably the most noticeable, with the new romanceable characters added to the Story of Seasons remake, Jennifer and Brandon. I didn't see all of their heart events, but I did try to raise them up enough to at least get some kind of impression of them. And honestly, I have nothing to say about them at all. Brandon's whole thing is his eccentricity, but honestly he comes off a bit obnoxious to me. And Jennifer is okay, I guess, but nothing about her dialogue makes me want to get to know her better. I guess I don't mind them existing, but they really don't add anything to the game, and they rarely participate in anything going on in town. Remember earlier in the video when I said that the team decided to redesign the characters to allow this game to have its own identity? Is the identity in the room with us right now? All I'm seeing is an identity crisis. I'm of the opinion that if you're going to reimagine a game, for better or for worse, go big or don't do it at all. I think that the worst part about this remake to me is that I probably can't even hope for another Mineral Town remake. So I'll never get a version of the game with all of my favorite features from the more modern games in the series. And I certainly won't be getting a version that stays true to the spirit of what Back to Nature was trying to do. Which sucks. It does suck, I'm not gonna lie. Which is why I'm really glad that we haven't gotten an Animal Parade remake announcement yet. At least I can keep hoping that someday they'll figure out how to make a proper remake. Feeling kinda hopeful about Grand Bazaar, but you know, can't count your chickens before they hatch. At its current price, which is $39.99 USD as of the recording of this video, I don't know that I would tell anybody to run and get Story of Seasons Friends of Mineral Town. You can find it on sale on Steam occasionally for around 10 USD, and to be honest, I'd probably just recommend getting it that way or waiting for a sale if you want to get a physical copy. I like this game fine for what it is, but I really expected a lot more from it, and it fell short of my expectations. As a modern title, if you're not as good as games that came out over a decade ago, then you're not cutting it. Sorry, I know it's a remake, but you're still a modern farming sim and you're still competing against modern farming sims, so you have to, at the very minimum, be on their level. That's going to continue to be my measuring stick for the Switch era of Story of Seasons games until we get a game that actually surpasses the 3DS era. Now, for realsies, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that this tirade was at the very least entertaining. I will be breaking down the character heart events in the Mineral Town games, but since Grand Bazaar should be releasing shortly after I post this video, if I can make it in time, it might take a while to get to them. I haven't decided if I'll break down every single character's heart event in separate videos, or just a few in one big video, but something of that nature will come out soon. So if you for some reason want to hear me talk more about Mineral Town or any other farming sim for that matter, subscribe, hit the like button, and let me know in the comments. We've got to make the algorithm pop off with this one. Drag your mouse or finger over to the like button right now. I need the validation. With all that being said, until the stars align once again, so long and farewell, dear farmers. I'm gonna go take a power nap. I drank way too much tea.